Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to Trasna this evening, Trasna the Tira this evening. I'm joined, or we're all joined by Síofra O'Donovan this evening. This Sunday, the 1st of November, marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Kevin Barry, one of our best known Irish patriots. Síofra is Kevin's grandniece, and she recently published a book on Kevin. The title of the book is Yours Till Hell Freezes Over, and it's a memoir of the life of Kevin Barry. So tonight, Síofra is here with us, and she's going to discuss Kevin's life, his legacy, and her new book. So you're very, very welcome to Trasna the Tira, Síofra.
Thank you very much. I don't know how much you know about the book, Yours Til Hell Freezes, but I just wanted to give you a few images of Kevin Barry this evening. And I thought I'd start off by just reading you a bit about his college life and how that was for him. Dublin in those days was a much more lively place than it is now. But just to start at the beginning anyway, as you can see, Kevin Barry was born on the 20th of January 1902, and he was born at number 8 Fleet Street in Dublin. The Barry family lived half in Dublin, and where they had also a dairy yard in Pimlico on the same street that James Connolly lived. I think he lived in number 54. They had it on 54, and he was in number 45. And he died, as we know, on the 1st of November 1920 at 8 o'clock in Mountjoy jail. So in my book, I've gone through a lot of different military documents and witness statements and family papers that hadn't been used or seen before. I draw, of course, from my father's work. Dowlings O'Donovan, he wrote a book in 1989 called Yours Til Hell Freezes. Sorry, no, that's my book. His was called Kevin Barry and His Time. So I thought I'd give you a taste of Kevin, because I'm going to read you one of his letters at the end of this extract, which he signs with the title of the book, which I drew my inspiration because he was somebody of great humor and wit and lightheartedness, really. And though in other ways he was very focused, as you know, as a soldier of the Republic. So back in 1919, when Kevin joined UCD, it was bursting at the seams after World War I. Todd Andrews was in UCD at the time, and Frank Flood and many others, but some of them who were in the IRA, they knew about each other, but they didn't always greet each other. I mean, obviously they were bound to secrecy as well. They'd taken an oath. So they couldn't let it be known that they knew each other were in the IRA either. So Frank Flood, who had been a friend of Kevin Barry's from a young age and who joined the same H company as Kevin in 1917, they're both the same age. They'd been in the O'Connell schools together when they were younger in Dublin. And Frank Flood was a friend of Kevin's in UCD. Todd Andrews is there as well. That's Ryan Tubridy's grandfather. And he knew Kevin, but by face, but he said, because he was a rugby player and a Jesuit boy, I knew he was one of us, although this fact in no way helped to foster our acquaintance. There was a number of students who were known to be IRA men, but unless they were in the same battalion or company, they never spoke or associated with one another. And that's what Todd Andrews said about Kevin. And he also thought, you know, he was a bit of a Belvedere boy in his eyes, so didn't feel too much affiliation apart from that he knew behind the scenes they're both in the IRA. Another person who was in UCD at the time was Jim O'Donovan, who'd completed his chemistry degree. He was my grandfather, and he was very busy. He was already by this time director of chemicals in the IRA GHQ. Now, he didn't actually hang around with Kevin, but he was going to become his brother-in-law, but after Kevin died, of course, because he married Kevin's younger sister, Monty Barry, who was my grandmother. So Kevin, while he was at college, was an avid dancer and a keen drinker. Jerry McAleer, a friend of his from Belvedere, first of all, he didn't know that Kevin was in the IRA, but he also didn't know how much he drank. And Kevin was very fond of drinking. Jerry McAleer said, Kevin and Charlie O'Neill, a close mutual friend, were great dancing people. I never bothered my head going to dances, but Kevin and Charlie and one or two others had nights out in those low-down dance halls. If they drank, it was damn little or nil. That's what Jerry McAleer said, but little did he know. Kevin's dancing took off in the dance halls of Dublin. A UCD student, Honoria Orkney, met Kevin at a Cayley. They were dancing to The Siege of Ennis, a dance in which you change partners. And Kevin said, I didn't know the Carlow girls knew anything about dancing. To which Honoria answered, I didn't know rugby players knew anything about it either. Kevin and a lot of young IRA clientele and UCD students as well, used to go to a very famous coffee shop called Matassa Ice Cream and Coffee House on Marlborough Street in Dublin. Frank Flood also went there, and Frank Flood had his last cup of coffee there just before he went and did his ambush in 1921, for which he was court-martialed and executed by the same executioner as Kevin Barry. He was, as you know, one of the 9 or one of the 10 who were executed in Mountjoy. So after the King's Inns raid on the 1st of June 1920, which Frank Flood took part in as well as Kevin, Kevin took the Lewis gun that he managed to take from the King's Inns on that raid. He took it over to his place in Fleet Street and then adjourned to our usual spot in Matassa's on Marlborough Street for coffee. So that was in a letter that he wrote. Todd Andrews, on the other hand, and his crew, they used to lunch in Robert's Cafe on Grafton Street. 2 rolls, butter in a bun, or baked bean on toast. Robert's became a sort of club for us, and we got to know the waitresses very well. Even with the curfew that was going on in 1920, Dublin was spilling with life and entertainment and fun, in stark contrast to the ghost town that we see today. And here's a letter. I'll just read you a letter from Kevin to his dear friend Bapty Marr down in Thigh, County Kildare. So Bapty actually went on to marry Kevin Barry's sister, Shell Barry. How the devil are you at all? You know, you might write to a fellow once in a while. I wouldn't mind me not writing because I'm very busy. Pictures, National Library, and Grafton 5 to 6 p.m. But a fellow like you, a bloody gentleman of leisure, you know it's unforgivable. By the way, bloody bastard never came with the suit, with the result that I have to borrow one for the dance tomorrow night. Write and tell him and say that I say he's a right so-and-so. And when are you going to be up in town? You ought to come for a Cayley in the College of Science on the 30th of January. Yours till hell freezes, Kevin. So that's a typical kind of breezy, light letter from Kevin. And I'll be going through a few of the letters and you'll be able to see actual images and you'll see his handwriting. And his letters really do enact the time that he was in, and Kevin's personality, his character really comes through so well, so strongly. Anyway, remember that all this time that Kevin was having fun dancing and meeting girls and drinking and everything, he was also a very dedicated soldier. And he'd already accomplished by the 1st of June 1920, which was the end of his first year in UCD, he was already, he'd already done the King's Inns raid. So that was a successful raid, and that had been done with under 5 minutes. They had performed it under 5 minutes, extremely well planned, and nobody had been hurt, nobody had been shot. And on the strength, then he went down to Carlow for that summer of 1920, and he was involved in different raids down there, but in particular Okavana Barracks. In early July, the C Company of the Carlow Brigade, which Kevin was part of with his brother Michael Barry, who Michael Barry had joined in 1917. They and Matt Cullen, they and about 10 other men cycled up to Okavana Barracks to burn the whole thing down. John Edmund's son was occupying it as a home or a hunting lodge. And they weren't successful in doing it, because Matt Cullen gave a report to my grandfather when my grandfather was researching his book on Kevin Barry, which was never published in the 1950s. And Matt Cullen said that there was a hysterical woman who basically stopped Kevin in his tracks. Kevin came in through the back window, and I think he did have a revolver. And John Redmond's son, who was in the house with his wife Joanna, he held up a mallet. And then this woman came in and stopped everything. And this woman, this hysterical woman, I discovered when I was interviewing a few men down in Knockananna in County Wicklow. One of them came forward and he said, well, my father told me that woman was the housekeeper, and it was she that put a stop to everything, to the burning down of the barracks, which is what the active service unit had ordered. They said that barracks is to be burnt, and it wasn't burnt down, and it wasn't used to house auxiliaries as they had planned either, on the British side. So Kevin, Kevin's life was very compartmentalized. He was, a very dedicated soldier. By the time he would have come back up from that summer in Carlow to Dublin in September, he was first of all, he was supposed to be ready to do his medical reset exams. He'd failed them in the summer, due to all his activities, his socializing and his, raid on the King's Inns and everything, and all of that he was involved with on the ground for the H Company in Dublin. It was beginning to have an effect. And so by the 20th of September, he was supposed to do his medical reset reset exams at 2:00, and the raid on the Monk's Bakery took place in the morning at around 11 o'clock. I can go into a more detailed story and an account of the Monk's Bakery raid if we have some time, because it's quite interesting, because I read several different witness accounts that hadn't been used before, and my father hadn't read them either when he was doing his book, because they weren't in fact available at that time. So let's move on with a few images and bring you back in time a little bit. There's Kevin when he's 3 years old in the hat and pinafore, typical, probably taken around 1905 by a photographic studio, looking extremely innocent and almost like a little girl, an endearing kind of a photograph. And the photograph of the nun there with the woman beside her is Kevin's older sister Kitby. This was quite a few years later after Kevin's execution, but this is Sister Cecilia. She was called Margaret Dowling, and Margaret Dowling had been a matron in London, the Victoria Hospital, and she may have inspired Kevin to study medicine, because there was nobody else in the family who had gone to study medicine. So she may have had an influence on him. That's why I put the picture up of her there. Down at the bottom there, we have Mrs. Barry and my grandmother and my father and different people in the family. We have a picture here of Kevin and his brother Michael. And Michael was always down in Carlow minding the farm, and he was involved in the Sea Company during the War of Independence. And afterwards, I'll show you some interesting images of Michael Barry relating to his arrest in December 1920. Just a month. So going back a little bit more in time, we have the Dowlings on the Barry side. Kevin Barry's mother was Mary Dowling, and she married Tom Barry in 1895. And this was Mary Dowling's father, James Dowling. And very unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Ellen McCardle, who married James Dowling. Ellen McCardle was Kevin Barry's maternal grandmother. And she was known in the family home where she was installed after her own husband died as Nana Dowling. And there were a lot of stories about Nana Dowling, how she could see ghosts and things. She's a fascinating character. So they lived in the townland, not the downland, of Drumgwyn, which is very near Tom Bay, where the Barrys had their farming stronghold since the 1700s. There's a lot of detail about that in the book. I did a lot of research into going really quite far back. In fact, ironically, oh dear, I can't see the arrows anymore. Where's they gone? Oh, there they are. I just have to go back. Yeah, there's a lot of that's a nice sort of one focus on Kevin as a 3-year-old. The oldest Barry, the first Barry to come to Ireland was ironically an Anglo-Norman, Geraldus de Barry. This is in Ned O'Toole's memoir, Wished for Your Life, That's Treason. It's a marvellous memoir. He was Kevin Barry's schoolmaster in Rathvilly, and he knew a lot about genealogy and history and archaeology, and he was a very scholarly man. And he did some research and found that the first Barry to come to Ireland was Geraldus de Barry, who was the tutor to King John Plantagenet. So it's very ironic that the first Barry to come to Ireland was Anglo-Norman, and that Kevin Barry was in fact a descendant of his. So there were others going back. There was actually Kevin would have been very influenced by the stories of 1798 around Carlow and Wicklow, and one of his ancestors, a Hutchinson, was actually a yeoman, a Quaker yeoman from Tipperary, but he ran away, married a girl called Kate Mear, and they came up together to Carlow, and he had been disinherited, but his godfather bought him some land in Carlow, so that's how he ended up in Carlow. And they lived in a house called Ballyhacket House, and he betrayed the yeoman and became fought with Michael Dwyer's men and fought in 1798. So Kevin did have some rebels in his lineage, which isn't surprising really. But what I found surprising is that the progenitor of the Barrys in Ireland was Anglo-Norman, and the tutor to King John Plantagenet, who's the sort of almost the first conqueror of Ireland. So here are the present Barrys in the house at Tombay. This is the very house that Kevin Barry would have actually lived in. And the older man there is Kevin Barry Jr. and his wife Evelyn, and their daughter Niamh, and Kevin and Mick and Neil, and their various children. And it's a wonderful photograph. The photographer for the book is a really wonderful photographer called Lisa McNamara. So this is an image here of Kevin Barry Jr. in the parlour in Tombay, and you can see a portrait of Kevin in his trench coat, and you can see a portrait here in the background here. If you can still see me, you don't only see the screen share. Kevin Barry in the oval portrait there, it's that typical picture of Kevin who looks like an older, more worldly man with his trench coat and his grin, and I always remembered that as a child in my home. And to me he looked like Tintin. So Kevin Barry it wasn't a morose story. It wasn't like the story of Christ on the cross. It wasn't the martyr story that we got at home. My father always told me the stories of Kevin, and his lightheartedness and his love of socializing, of dancing, of cycling around Wicklow, cycling up to the Glendalough Hotel and having lots of drinks and falling into the ditch occasionally and meeting girls and all sorts of things. So that's who Kevin Barry was to me growing up, although I did understand some of the gravity of the end of his days, but certainly I didn't really look into that until my own father died, and I decided to write this book about Kevin Barry. Now, this is an image of the hiding hole that they have in Tombay, which is where they tried to put De Valera in there when he was using Tombay as a safe house, but he couldn't fit in. He was too tall. So other men like Mick Barry, Kevin Barry's brother, would have hidden in there when he was going to be arrested in December 1920. The British soldiers came to the house to arrest him, and he was hiding there. But they did find him, and they took him off, and he was in Lincoln prison for 18 months. So this is another image of here's a more extended image with Kevin Barry beneath it. The hiding place is like a little attic space, So Eamon de Valera was too tall to fit in the hiding place, and Michael Barry told Kevin Barry Jr. there that De Valera used to expect his boots to be polished, waiting outside the door for him in the morning. De Valera, he was a very tall, kind of stately man, but he did have Asperger's, so he did have an awkward way of communicating. And the story of De Valera, runs through the whole. You can see that the Barrys were close, and obviously they were on the same side, during the Civil War as well. But there was great bitterness later on towards De Valera because he became a as you know, he banned the IRA in the 1930s, and there were some very severe executions in Portlaoise prison in 1936 of George Plant, and that was the time that a lot of people who were more extreme in their Republican feeling and activity, like my own grandfather and the Barrys, they were very, very, very angry about this, and they turned their backs on De Valera. So when De Valera showed up at my great grandmother's funeral in 1953, Mrs. Barry died, Kevin Barry's mother died. They actually shunned their own Taoiseach. So my own father tried to make reparations with De Valera, and he went on to actually went to Arsenault in 1970, and De Valera turned to him, my father, and said, if your father has any bitterness towards me, would you ask him to forgive me, please? And my father said, of course, because my father was a peacemaker. And my grandfather, when he told my grandfather, what De Valera had said, well, my grandfather, Jim, wouldn't speak to my father for 4 days. So he still held the bitterness in his heart, sadly. Now there's a lovely picture of Kevin Barry Jr. in the front half door of Tombay. Yeah, and it's still, Kevin Barry would have gone through that door many, many times. That's Kevin. And here's an image of handwriting on the door in Tombay. It's hard to decipher what it actually says, but I think when you see Kevin's handwriting, you'll see that it's similar. So I do think that Kevin did right. That's me with Kevin Barry there in the front hall of Tombay. And here's an unusual image, which is in the family of Kevin and Michael and up in Lugnaquilla. Just a summer's day, Kevin's last summer. One of them is Tom Malloy, who was actually the watchman on the drive of Tombay House. When De Valera and the likes were using Tombay as a safe house, Tom Malloy was the watchman, and he'd often come out covered in muck, as they said. And once he was caught and interrogated, and they were all really scared that he was going to just spill the beans on everybody, because he was such a he wasn't the most clever, so they were just afraid that he wouldn't be smart enough to conceal what he needed to conceal. Anyway, that's a picture of Michael Barry and Kevin Barry and Tom Malloy and somebody else. I think it's Pat O'Gorman, who had a car service in Hackettstown, and he was a good friend of Kevin Barry and Michael Barry. So this is Kevin Barry with his brother Michael around 1919. Lovely photograph. So Kevin went to school in Rathvilly. His teacher, as I said, was Ned O'Toole. His father died, Kevin Barry's father died in 1902 when Kevin was just 6 years old. So there was a decision made in the family up in Fleet Street. They sent some of the children down to Carlow to be schooled. So Kevin was sent down, and he went to Rathvilly School with his brother Michael. And their schoolmaster was Ned O'Toole, who was himself a strong nationalist and a member of the IRB. So that is a significant influence on Kevin in his very young life. And you can imagine a boy of 6 who's lost his father. He'd probably identified and listened and soaked up a lot of the stories and the history that Ned O'Toole would have told him. And Ned O'Toole was so distraught by the impending execution of Kevin Barry in 1920 that he asked an MP called Devlin to go, who I think was a friend of his, he was either Carlow or Kilkenny MP, was to go to Westminster and to beg Lloyd George for a reprieve for Kevin. Now, Kevin himself didn't want a reprieve, but this is what Ned O'Toole did. And Devlin went, and Devlin did every single thing that he could to get Kevin a reprieve and to get Lloyd George, who Lloyd George apparently just turned on the tears. He was great at that. But then when it came to getting an answer, he disappeared off to the Isle of Wight on a holiday or something. And then Devlin even tried to contact King George, and he also had gone off on his weekend holiday and was nowhere to be found. So, you know, very downheartedly, you know, Devlin had to tell O'Toole, you know, that he had failed to get a reprieve for Kevin. And this picture here is of Kevin in Belvedere. You'll see another version of that in a while. So I just wanted to show you some pictures around Rothvilly. This is a little bit outside. Ned O'Toole would have done studies of archaeology in the area. So this is actually the entrance to a seat of an old local king. There's a mound and a bit of a fort at the top of this. This is Lisnava House, which belonged to Lord Rathsdonnell. And a lot of people would have been employed in that house in Rathvilly. So that was quite significant house in the area. And that's just a bit of a joke there. I took that picture in Knockananna a couple of summers ago. And then, you know, Kevin grew older and he went to the O'Connell schools for not that long. He attended those with Frank Flood, and Frank Flood was his friend at the time, and that's where they actually met when Kevin was a young teenager. And while he was there, a lot of the children's parents were activists, or they were Republicans, and Kevin got his hands on a pair of tickets to go to the commemoration of the Manchester martyrs. This was in 1915, and so Kevin bought 2 tickets, one for him and one for his sister Kitby, and they went, and it was in the Mansion House on Dawson Street, and they met a few people that they knew, but they both felt afterwards that they were truly committed to republicanism. And Kevin then declared that he wanted to join Fianna Air, and he was only 13 years old on the spot, and his mother said, "No way, you're not doing that." But it wasn't very long later, just 2 years later, that he joined the H Company of the Dublin Brigade. So there's some images from Belvedere College, because Kevin joined Belvedere College around 1917. And Belvedere was a very posh school. His sister Kitby, who had taken responsibility for the management of the family since the father had died, and she used to help her mother with everything. She would have been very keen for Kevin to go to a very good school. So she made sure that he got a place in Belvedere. And so that's his writing desk there. And there we have the roof, the stucco roof. I think it's the Stapleton, very famous stucco work. And there's the front of Belvedere College. And of course, other pupils here were James Plunkett, James Joyce, and Kevin Barry would have shared teachers, you know, would have had some of the same teachers, certainly Dempsey, the same English teacher. And of course, it was a Jesuit school. There was a mentor that Kevin had in Belvedere called Tom Coonahan, and he was very fond of Kevin, and he was a real mentor to Kevin. And in Kevin's final days, he called for Tom Coonahan, who wasn't a fully trained priest at that point, to come and give him counsel and guidance, you know, in the days coming up to his death. And we can really see through some very moving accounts by Tom Coonahan, which were once in the rector's archives of Belvedere, but they're not there anymore. But I have them from my father's book. Just the level of piety that Kevin had. It's not something we think about very much, but he actually did. He was very pious, and he joined the Our Lady of the Sodality in Belvedere, and of course Belvedere had its own private chapel. But he would have had a lot of spiritual guidance then from Tom Coonahan in his final days, and he had asked his mother and sister to go specifically to Tom Coonahan and ask for help. You know, he did. We do think him as being very courageous, and certainly he was. And I've shown you all the cheerful side of Kevin, but you know, he needed that guidance. He was facing, you know, death at a very young age, and you know, it wasn't like he was just suddenly shot. It was like he had time to consider things. You know, I know that he certainly wished to be shot. He wished to be shot like a soldier and not hang like a dog. But I'm just saying that I know it was a very short period of time. Probably shorter than it should have been, from the court-martial to the execution, from arrest to court-martial to execution. It was a very short time. It was under 2 months. And so he would have known by the 20th of October that he was sentenced to death. And that gave him just 11 days on 11 or 12 days until he was actually to face the gallows and to face the noose and to really consider what it was that he was doing, why he had done it, what his purpose was, why was he dying. And he knew that he wanted this. That was the strangest part of it, and at the same time most understandable part of it. He wanted that. He wanted to die. He knew that it would further the cause, and it did. So here's an image from the chapel in Belvedere College, stained glass. I think it's from the Harry Clarke studio. And there's an image that, you know, we can imagine that Kevin would have seen, although it was mainly the priests that were cloistered in this part of the school, and this beautiful stucco work, which has all been restored in Belvedere College. So if you see then directly through the window, through that door, that is where the chapel is in Belvedere College. Perhaps some of you have been there and you've seen the collection of things that they have for Kevin Barry, you know, relating to Kevin Barry. There were a lot of letters and documents and cap and his school cap and his writing desk and many letters as well. So there's just a modern image of Kevin Barry by the TY students. Wouldn't say it really reflects his true face. It's a bit, he looks very dour in that. And I never think of Kevin as being dour. And then they have a memorial plate to those who died in World War I, because conscription, as we know, was a big deal during this time. There was a lot of pressure for conscription. There were a lot of, you know, students in Belvedere who would have been conscripted, and then there were a lot of them who died, 30 or 40. And then there were those who died in the Rising. So these are the center ones in memoriam. And then we have the ones who died in the War of Independence, which, as you can see, is only Kevin Barry. Then the Irish Civil War, Cathal Brugha, and Fred Little, and then the Second World War. So yeah, it's very interesting little plaque because it says a lot. Sorry, I've lost my arrows again. Sorry about that. So I wanted to show you this here. Kevin Barry's best friend in Belvedere College was Jerry McAleer, who was from Dungannon. And so Jerry McAleer had, his family had a hotel up in Dungannon, and Kevin used to go up with him sometimes at the weekends, and they shared the same digs in Dublin as well. So they didn't share the same digs, but Mrs. Tipping had digs on South Circular Road, and that was where Jerry McAleer stayed. And once when Kevin went up, they were doing a windowsill and it was being re-cemented, and Kevin Barry carved his name into it. So Kevin Barry's Jerry McAleer's daughter, Ivana Kennedy, has this actually in her possession. So this is the windowsill that Kevin Barry carved his name into. I don't know if you may have ever come across that before. So this is Kevin Barry, as we know. This is one of the infamous photographs. This is what some of the academics say, that this is the boy image of boyhood that was touted out, and you know, to propagate an image of Kevin Barry as a young martyr. He certainly does look very young. I'd say he's probably 16 in that photograph, and he does look very innocent. And but it's as if some people are saying, you know, that it was a calculated piece of propaganda to send that photograph out. But in effect, Kevin was only a boy. In this photograph, he may have actually been 15, but this was a photograph that was very much used in the press afterwards. You know, so Kevin was a boy, but he was, by 18 years old, he was certainly a man. And we can see that in the images of Kevin in his trench coat, looking much more manly. And we know from his letters that he really was. I mean, he was a man of about town. He was a man of the world. You know, he had so many aspects to him, so many complexities, and such a full life for somebody who was just 18 years old. So anyway, Kevin joined the volunteers in Parnell Square, the H Company. Well, it was actually first of all the C Company, but changed into the H Company. So he was there with Frank Flood. He was, you know, he was only 15, 19, 17, and he was made mobilization officer for road. First of all, they laughed at him with his Belvedere cap, and nobody wanted to take him seriously, really, at all. But he was quickly made mobilization officer for road marches and then Sunday morning parades. And there's another image of him, which, you know, we can see innocence, but we can see something of his worldliness in this photo as well. It's quite grainy, but yeah. So I have a picture here which might throw you slightly. That's a picture of the Cairo gang there, but I just thought to kind of evoke the time that they were in the Cairo gang, which were these group of British intelligence officers. It's an absolutely, it reminds me of something from Peaky Blinders. So the H Company used to meet on O'Flanagan Club in Riders Row at 44 Rutland Square, which was now Parnell Square. Kevin was perceived of as competent volunteer, so they made him NCO soon after. We can see him in this other photograph on the right, you know, the H Company 1st Brigade. He was very proud, and he's got his volunteer costume on there and this hat, and he's, you know, clearly a very proud young soldier in the picture on the right that we can see there. So the ambush on the 20th September in 1920 was, of course, the event that changed everything for Kevin. This is just a photograph I give you of the scene after Kevin was arrested, and everybody gathered around Church Street, and everybody was, you know, wondering what on earth had just happened at this time. Captain Seamus Kavanagh had met Kevin Barry the day before the ambush, and Kevin had just come back from Carlow. Kevin had forgotten his gun; he'd left it in Tom Bay. And Captain Seamus Kavanagh of the H Company, who had planned the whole thing and done the reconnaissance on the ambush, he said, "You're not doing this. You have an exam, a medical resit exam tomorrow in college. You're not going to do this." And Kevin said, "I have to do this. You have to let me." And he just badgered him. And Captain Kavanagh decided that he would contact somebody he knew in UCD to make sure there were arrangements for Kevin to be able to do the exam again in case anything went wrong. And that was in Captain Kavanagh's own witness statement that I read. And Kevin was delighted, of course. And then the next morning he popped into Clarendon Street Church, went to an early mass on his way to the first meeting with his company to have another run through of the plan. And he was about 5 minutes late, and Captain Kavanagh was not impressed at all, wasn't happy with him. So anyway, off they went to the Monk's Bakery, and the lorry that was anticipated that was going to arrive there. The whole reason for the ambush was to just, you know, hold them up and take their arms. It was late. So one of the volunteers panicked. Well, I should say Captain Kavanagh and Frank Flood were hiding in behind Lenehan's pub. So the lorry was late. Kevin was hanging around reading a paper. Another volunteer, Bob Flanagan, was doing the same. And they were waiting, and anyway, they were waiting a long time. And because of the bad timing, everything went wrong. So Captain Kavanagh, when he did see the lorry coming, he waved the handkerchief, which was the signal to advance. And one of the volunteers panicked and ran up to the lorry and said, "Hands up." And chaos kind of ensued after that. There were shots. I'll just read you a bit here of a description. Sean O'Neill's in his statement said that he was the one who was in the company, that he was the one who went up and shouted "hands up" at the lorry, the men in the lorry, and that Bob O'Flanagan had asked him to do this. O'Neill ordered the troops to drop their rifles, and there was a shot, then more shots. The window of Mrs. Clark's dairy was shattered by a bullet. She moved into a back room. On 114 Church Street, Mrs. Chatham collapsed on the floor in fright. In the chaos, Kevin found himself under the lorry after his .38 Parabellum jammed, and this was a problem. Captain Kavanagh had given him this .38 Parabellum, but it was renowned for jamming. So that was why he went in under the lorry. because the gun had jammed. He'd been annoyed that he was assigned this gun. Bob O'Flanagan fled up Jervis Street with bullets digging up the street, part of a scalp in his head, and there was just chaos. And then suddenly Kevin found himself underneath the lorry, and the street was completely silent. And then a woman who owned a coal and vegetable shop, a woman called Mrs. Garrett, shouted and pointed at Kevin and said, "There's a man under the lorry." Very unfortunate. But he was taken out by, I think it was Private Barnes, the driver of the lorry. And he was taken off to Bridewell. And that's where he had his interrogation. And that's where he also was tortured, which he gave a testimony and account of later. So Mrs. Garrett might be the one to blame for everything. Some say rumours were rampant, of course, about her in Dublin at the time, that she was boycotted, run out of town, run over by a lorry, that she went mad, that she ended up in a lunatic asylum, traumatised by her own guilt. That was what Kevin's sister Kitby said in her witness statement. But it turned out, though, that a man called John Doyle, who was our neighbour in Bray when I was growing up, my father was talking to him about the book he was writing in 1989, and Mr. Doyle said to him, "Well, I actually knew Mrs. Garrett. I actually lived." John Doyle, he worked in a shop called Kavanagh's. He lived in Dublin at the time, and he worked in a shop called Kavanagh's just behind Lenihan's pub, the very place where Captain Kavanagh and Frank Flood were hiding during the ambush. So he knew Mrs. Garrett in her coal and vegetable shop in the corner of Church Street and King Street, and he said that she died of natural causes. None of the rumours were true. Anyway, the most important thing was that Kevin Barry himself attached no blame to Mrs. Garrett. He knew that she simply thought that he would be injured when the lorry moved off. And he told that to Kitby, in fact, when he met Kitby at the recess in the court-martial at the Marble Barracks. They had a talk, and that was where Kitby got her account from Kevin directly of what exactly had happened. And he told her at that point, "I did take a shot. I did shoot a British soldier." So in fact, even though the British didn't have a complete amount of proof and evidence, he actually had shot Private Whitehead. So there were letters then when he was in Mountjoy. There's several and many letters. There were many visits and many letters. And here we see one to his friend Jerry McAleer, who I've spoken quite a lot about. "Congratulations on your exam. I believe I stuck, but that shouldn't worry me. So how did all the others do? I suppose they did well. You are all swanky second medicals now. When will you," I can't read that word, "when will you be up again? I believe that Jim is coming up next. I will write to him and to Jack soon. By the way, tell Mrs. Tipping I'll settle up with her when I get out, if I ever do." Now we see that was written on the 1st of October 1920. So the court-martial he'd been in for 10 days at that stage. So I suppose he might have thought, well, I might get out. But of course, we know that on the 20th of October, he was court-martialed and quickly sentenced to death by hanging. And he would never be doing his second medicals, and he would never be a swanky medical student. But you can see all the humor, in his letter, and he's in prison and he's still optimistic. This is a letter from the staff. I actually really wanted to, I think I have this later. I don't want to switch to jump timelines. This is going forward to after Kevin's execution. I'll go back to this later. And this is also jumping forward a bit. Oh yeah. These are actually the last of the images that I have for you, but I just checked the time because I can't tell you everything about Kevin Barry's life in that time. Liam, how do you think we're doing for time? Should we take a break for questions and then I can go back and speak about this?
No, you're absolutely fine, Síofra. If you want to keep going, we'll catch up with the questions at the end. We're under no time pressure at all, so great lecture. Everyone's really enjoying it.
Okay. Well, but I had other pictures of the. Maybe they're further ahead or something. Oh, they are. Oh no. Sorry, it's all a bit mixed up now. I'll be jumping in around a little bit. There's another letter written on the 5th of October to Mrs. Doyle in Tuckmill. They were friends of the Barrys who lived a few miles away from Tom Bay. So you can see the transcription of the letter there. In fact, I can't really see it very well. Oh yeah, I can see it now. I don't know what you'll think of me for writing this, but I have not much else to do. That sounds bad, but it's only my only excuse. However, I hope you are all well. Also, all at Coolralig and Talbottown Fort. So I want you to remember me to them all, especially Joe D and Mark. Tell Joe I'll have a few new ones by the time I get out. Also your own Joe and Mamie and Luke. And also remember me to Leo and anyone else at West Park I know. This is an awful job, but I would not be able to write to them all myself, and I will hardly get another opportunity. Now, Slán Lat, and the best of luck to you all. Yours to a cinder. Signed, Kevin. So it's really very moving to think that, well, you know, it's written from Mountjoy on the 5th of October, and really, you know, he obviously knew already before he was even court-martialed that he was going to die, because that letter certainly would not indicate that he had really now at this point, 4 days after he wrote to Jerry McAleer with that sort of cheerful tone. There's a little bit more gravity in that letter. I think you'd agree. Now, this is slightly confusing because it is this is in Collins Barracks, this letter, and it's a farewell letter to Frank Flood. And Frank, you know, Frank Flood was his friend, as we know. He was in the H Company with him. He was on the King's Inns raid with him on the 1st of June 1920. He was on the ambush with him on the 20th of September 1920. They'd known each other since the O'Connell schools, and they were dear friends. They were around the same age, and they were both in UCD together. So there was a lot in common, really a lot. Dear Frank, we are going to heaven tomorrow, or to use our own Kevin's phrase. No, it says in the museum, it lists it as his last letter to Frank, the farewell letter to Frank Flood, but it's not, and it's not quite the same writing. But I'll read it anyway. We're going to heaven tomorrow, or to use our own Kevin's phrase, we are going over the top. Yes. So I don't know who actually wrote this. It seems to be signed off from a Frank as well. So cheer up and do not act the silly kipper. But you can also see a similar kind of tone in this letter. You know, it was just a certain phraseology that they had at the time. I think it's just so charming. Goodbye and God bless you and keep you from all danger. I will watch over the fight. Goodbye, and think of your old friend's comrade, Frank. It is after 1 o'clock and I'm going to bed to tell all the boys I could not write to them all. So it's another very sad farewell kind of letter. And here's another letter. See, Kevin's writing is really, he's quite messy, isn't he? I mean, you can see this in all his copybooks in Belvedere as well. He's very messy, and he's often just writing, it's doodling in the margins. He's doodling, sometimes he's drawing things like his, you know, his sister and his mother, and he draws pictures of them and cartoons of them and makes jokes about them. And in other parts of the margins of his copybooks, he's written up the Republic and all sorts of things. So this is a really interesting thing, which was actually after Kevin was executed. It was given along with his pen. This was returned to the Barry family, and Kitby had this in her possession for a long time. A copy of Knocknagow, The Home to Tipperary, was by Charles Kickham, a very famous novel, which, you know, was very much about the land struggles and nationalism, and would have been a very, very popular kind of signatory novel. in the 19th century in Ireland. But Kevin here in his inscription in the book, he's making a joke. So after he's sentenced, he's making a joke of his own life. And it's while it's very amusing, it's terribly sad as well. KGB Barry, a dangerous criminal, a decided menace to the British Empire, captured 20th September 1920, tried 20th of October 1920, hanged 1st of November 1920, up the prisons of war. Amongst the many crimes put down to this dangerous man, thus he did put pepper in the cat's milk and steal a penny from a blind man's beard, wilfully, feloniously, and of his malice aforethought, smiling deviously at something or other at the bottom. I can't quite remember what that says. So he's making a, almost a nursery rhyme and a joke out of his own sentence, So then he writes here on the other side, Kevin Barry, condemned cell, Mountjoy prison, 30th of October, 1920. And then he writes his name in Irish and up the Republic, which you often see in the margins of his copybooks in Belvedere, all of which you can see actually very easily in the UCD archives. You can simply go into the digital collection and visit them, and it's really, really quite amazing. And this is a sketch that I saw in Mountjoy prison. It's hanging in the museum in Mountjoy, and this is a sketch of a prison cell, so as it would have been at the time. So Kevin had a condemned cell, which was, the condemned cell had its own fireplace and its own bathroom, and it was just a few footsteps away from the gallows. He would have had to walk out in the fresh air and walk another way and into the gallows. So you can imagine his cell was something like that. This is in the gallows. It still exists. It's still there today. This is Sean Reynolds, a wonderful retired prison guard from Mountjoy, who helped me so much with my research in the Mountjoy part of the book, and the detail which he helped me go into, because he actually oversaw the exhumation of the bodies of the Forgotten 10, and he could describe to me in detail, and this is all written in the book in great detail, about how he saw the cufflinks on Kevin's shirt and the waistcoat and the buttons and his boots, which were completely intact. So here we are in the place where Kevin Barry left this world, and there's Sean looking quite reflective over the gallows itself. Quite a significant moment, and this is the chain from which he was hanged. Difficult to look at, but important that we do remember. And it wasn't just Kevin, there were many others who were hanged in those gallows. This is the memorial in Mountjoy to those forgotten 10 men who really haven't been forgotten. And for many years, as we know, until 2001, those bodies were in Mountjoy. Now, there was a beautiful description of Kevin's funeral, described in Canon Waters' letters to Mrs. Barry after Kevin's death. He described, imagine, of course, his mother couldn't go to his funeral, nobody could go to his funeral, but there was Canon Waters, and then there was his warder, Patrick Berry, who had also been Thomas Ashe's warder, and also Proctor. There's a man called Proctor, who was his second chosen warder for, who would be with him all the way up to the time of the execution. So they would have attended to Kevin's little funeral, but Canon Waters made it as respectful and as ceremonial as he could under the circumstances, So it was Sean Reynolds. So we saw there that actually this was taken from, I think this was taken from the waistcoat. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just left behind and sent back to the family, but this ended up in the National Museum. This is Kevin's little rosary that was on his possession. So it probably was simply given back to the family and somehow got to the museum, because anything that was found on Kevin's body when it was being exhumed was kept intact, and he was reburied with that in Glasnevin Cemetery. So they were found in his uniform. That's what it was. Sorry. Yeah, they were found in his uniform. Here we have an image of the crowds who gathered outside when Kevin was being executed, and there was an image of another mother. Now, just remember that Mrs. Barry and Kitby, his sisters, they weren't actually at the gates when Kevin was being executed. They went to Mass in Clarendon Street. They saw the Cumann na mBan women pass by, and they had the salute, and they had gone home. And down in Tombay and Carlow, they were saying the rosary at 8 a.m. as well. There were crowds outside the house in Carlow as well. But this is actually a photograph of Mrs. Thomas Whelan, Thomas Whelan's mother, from Galway, and in March 1921. Now, I think he may have been the one who was hanged in a pair with Frank Flood, but I'm not quite sure. Thomas Bryan may have been the one who was hanged with Frank Flood. Thomas Bryan was actually the great uncle of George O'Dowd, Boy George. So the last question then for us is, how do we remember Kevin? And this is a poem my father wrote, which I really love. A crowded year. Are you the nephew of who tried to unveil the elegant tart in the train from Rathvilly, who murdered a gallon of Smithwick's lying on a bed with the Belgian bird in the Glendalough Inn by the lake beyond Lara? Are you the nephew of robbed a Lewis gun laughing from the King's Inn showing Dinny Holmes' new toy? Are you the nephew of caught under a soldier's lorry, tortured, tried and fed apples and grapes till he hang dangled dead from an alien rope? So my father, as you can see, would have very much remembered Kevin, the young man who loved drinking and having fun, as well as the tragic end and the military life that he led in the last 3 years of his very young life. And my father died in 2009. It was after that I decided to write this book about Kevin Barry and to draw from new material. But I also, of course, draw a lot from my father's material, and my father drew a lot from his father's material, Jim O'Donovan. His biography of Kevin Barry, however, was never published. This is a picture of my father with Charlie Haughey at the launch of his own book in UCD Earl's Terrace in 1989. And this is Elgin Barry, who was the last surviving sibling of Kevin Barry, my great aunt. And she's talking to her niece here. There's not very good quality, but I just sort of pulled that off the internet quite quick. I tried to get permission from the photographer to use the photograph, but I couldn't. And then how do we remember Kevin? In 1958, there was a committee for the Memorial of Kevin Barry. Then this memorial to Kevin Barry was unveiled in 1958, and a marvelous photograph of that here. And we have Mrs. Thomas Clark here, and I'm not exactly sure who the others are. I know that all my relatives are in there, but they're not in this photograph. But they're the Rathvilly Committee. I'm part of that now, and we've been organising for a life-size bronze statue of Kevin Barry to be erected just near this memorial. And unfortunately, because of the times we live in, that had to be cancelled because nobody's allowed to gather at all. So we'll be doing that later next year when it's all back to normal, if we're ever back to normal. So again, Mrs. Thomas Clark there. And then there was earlier than that, in the 30s, there was this committee in UCD led by Mac O'Reilly, who married Kevin's sister Elgin, who you saw the photograph of there at my father's book launch. They organised and fundraised for the Harry Clark Studio to produce this beautiful stained glass window of Kevin Barry among, Red Hugh O'Donnell and Robert Emmett and Patrick Pearse and the signatories of the proclamation, who we can see in the bottom here. And that window is now hidden away in UCD in the medical building, and nobody can see it, except the odd student. So it really ought to be in plain sight. As a proper memorial. It doesn't really serve its purpose hidden away in the medical building in UCD in Belfield. But it was in the Kevin Barry room in Earlsford Terrace for a long time, and that's where my father launched his book on Kevin Barry. Other things that were done, you know, at the 50th anniversary of Kevin Barry, they issued these day of issue stamps. Oh, sorry, lost that again. Oh dear. I keep losing the arrows. I can't see it. There we go. I have to go back. Sorry. Yeah, so this is addressed to Kevin Barry. So this is down in Kevin Barry Jr.'s house down in the family home, first day of issue. So, I mean, we certainly don't have anything like that this year. This is the 100th anniversary. So it does say something about how we're choosing to commemorate or not commemorate, which has become a controversial point. And some people, you know, writing in the Irish Times seem to see it as a shameful thing to commemorate Kevin Barry. But I would always say that, you know, Kevin Barry was part of an army that was mandated by Dáil Éireann, a democratically elected government, and they were fully accountable to that government. They weren't, you know, terrorists with guns and throwing grenades at people. They were the army that formed the present Army of Ireland, and what they did form, you know, what they gave and their actions, whether that involved shooting and being shot or whatever it involved, it was a war between two armies. And in the end, you know, we wouldn't have a republic if it wasn't for what they did. And so Boris Johnson would be our Taoiseach if they hadn't done what they did. So I'm not a raving Republican or anything, but I can't understand why people are ashamed of their own heritage, and why, look what they did even just 50 years after Kevin died, and they issued this stamp, and look what they did in 2001 and reinterred the bodies with the most incredible ceremony. Sure, Fianna Fáil might have been trying to hijack it for their own ends, but it certainly honoured those men. And now, what do we see today? An Ireland that's, better stop talking now. So there we have I wasn't actually there. I was actually living in America at the time, but I have seen footage of it, and it was an extraordinary event. So that's Kevin's mass card there. So I'm going to, I stop the screen share now, and if anybody has any questions, if you like to ask any questions now, you're very welcome to.
That's great, Síofra. Thank you very much for that. I have a gazillion compliments come in on the chat there. Everyone's very complimentary, and they've all really enjoyed the lecture. And I have a couple of questions as well.
Sure.
I just have a few. I won't keep you too long. There's one from Barry early on in the lecture, and I see it in the local media here in the Carlow Kilkenny area lately. But can you share a little bit about the history of Kevin's death mask?
Oh, I actually don't know an awful lot about that. I know that my cousin Ian Dowling bought it at an auction, and I've seen the mask myself, and I understand that it was made very soon after he died. And when I saw it, we all gathered down in Tom Bay about a month ago or so, and it was very moving to see that mask, because you could actually see his youth in that mold, in that face. It was really, really took me aback. He really did look very young in this image in the death mask. It was very ghostly. I don't know who actually made that. I don't know its provenance. I don't know how it got out into the world, and Ian Dowling got it at an auction. I'm not sure where he got it, but he first presented it on his show, The Irish Pickers, Rare Irish Pickers, and he has, he goes around collecting different objects and telling histories through it. It's a wonderful thing. It's on Sky. I don't know a huge deal about it, I'm afraid, though.
Okay, thank you, Síofra.
That I have here, actually. A lot of people in the family have one of these plaques. I have this, which is a profile, a sort of plaster of Paris mold. So a lot of people in the family, but we don't know the provenance of this. We don't know the artist or anything about it, but I do know several branches of the extended family have one of these. So I'm not sure about that either. it's interesting as well, you know.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that with us, Síofra. I've a question from Des Dalton, who gave us a great lecture a few weeks ago on the active service units throughout Ireland. Des's question is, what sources were available to you that weren't available to your father, and what new light did that allow you to shine on Kevin and Kevin's history?
Well, my father wrote that he had access to one very good witness statement, which was Kitby Barry's, Kathleen Barry's. Now, he wasn't allowed to acknowledge that in his own book because it wasn't in the public domain. Now, several other witness statements were released after that over the years. Dad published that book in 1989. So I went through a lot of the volunteers. One absolutely fantastic witness statement was Sean Prendergast. This witness statement is about 800 pages long. It goes into such detail, and he also writes in quite a sort of flowery kind of a way, but also incredibly practical in understanding the logistics of how the guerrilla war was fought. You know, he describes the logistics of that war absolutely brilliantly, and then he brings to life, you know, Dublin at the time. That was where I got a lot of the information about Dublin social life, with Matassa's Coffee House, and that Frank Flood had his last coffee there. And he said if those walls of this cafe could speak, you know, all the people that the walls had seen, you know, from the IRA who had gone through. Anyway, that was another one. Sean O'Neill, Seamus Kavanagh, you know, I went through all those witnesses statements, which Dad mustn't have had access to. So it gave me an amazing variety of perspective on the ambush as well. Now, what else did I have access to? Well, a lot of family letters, but Dad would have had access to those as well. But I went through my father's cassette interviews that he did with people in Carlow and Wicklow and in Dublin, and he hadn't included things from those interviews that I thought were wonderful. For example, one cassette, he was doing an interview with Mags Leonard, who was the daughter of Proctor, the warder Proctor, who was Kevin's close warden in Mountjoy up to his time of death. And this woman, Mags Leonard, she had a wonderful way of describing, you know, Dublin, what it was like for a child to see the black and tans, and the kids would be given money by the guards in Mountjoy. She lived at the back of Mountjoy, and they'd be sent off to buy, you know, sweets and cigarettes for the soldiers. Just magical things like that I just kept coming across. And the final thing that was really amazing that I came across was the witness statement of Father Lawrence, who was a priest in Clarendon Street Church, and he was close to Canon Waters, and Canon Waters had described to him in detail many years later his last hours and days with Kevin Barry. So I got very detailed description. My father most certainly hadn't read that. But I could not have written this book without my father's book behind me. That is for sure. But there are certain things, you know, I mean, that I wrote about that Dad didn't write so much about. I mean, he drew a lot from Kitby Barry's witness statement, Kevin Barry's older sister, but he couldn't give her credit because it wasn't in the public domain. But he took chunks out of it anyway. And anyway, what I found, actually at one point in the writing of this book, I had a full chapter on the women in the Barry family. I wanted that to be, it was such an important part of his life. His father died when he was 6. Kate Kinsler was the housekeeper on Fleet Street. She was a huge influence, very Republican woman. You know, Kitby Barry, she was older, she was very influential. He had all sorts of, you know, matriarchal women in his life that also bolstered his career in republicanism, you know.
Thanks, Síofra. Just a question myself, and I only read some extracts from it recently, but in Kevin's trial, he was quite defiant for such a young man in terms of his approach to the whole trial. Do you think that was part of his personality coming out, or was that, I suppose, a performance or a portrayal of his own defiance against the British establishment in Ireland at that time?
That's a really interesting question. I think it was a combination of both. I mean, he had that kind of lightheartedness. So we have this image of Kevin in court saying, well, I don't recognize the court, and no, and no, and no, you know, and very defiant, but not sort of heavily, angrily defiant. That's not him. It was Kevin holding up a newspaper and just saying, righty-o, well, I don't recognize this court. you know, and then there's Sean Hui, he has to step down as a solicitor, you know, but before he did that, he managed to get an agreement that they would read the testimony of his torture. But so he worked it quite cleverly. But yeah, a combination of both, definitely a combination of both. He was both, you know, doing what he had to do because he could not recognize the court because that was a compromise, you know. And he had that kind of personality, you know. He's surrounded by, you know, he's a huge court-martial team, the president, Onslow, you know, really the heaviest of British officials in front of him, and he's still able to maintain that lightness, you know. Amazing.
A number of people, Síofra, have commented about obviously the iconic song about Kevin. How important do you feel that song is in terms of remembering Kevin and maintaining his legacy?
Well, it seemed to come out very soon. It seemed to be written very soon after he died. It does seem to be the thing that has turned him into almost a myth, you know, a legendary figure. Because whenever you say the name, if people are aware of it, maybe the younger generation aren't so much now, they'll, you know, oh, the song. It's always the song. And so there's the story about how Paul Robeson met two Irish guys out in America. Their car broken down, or maybe his car broken down, and they got talking. And then they got singing and they got drinking. And that's where Paul Robeson heard the song and did his own version, made it very famous then. But certainly, yeah, it is. And Leonard Cohen did a version of it as well. And of course, every traditional Irish band. And, you know, you'll hear it sung in every pub in Ireland, except we're not allowed into pubs anymore.
We're not. Hopefully, by the end of November, we'll be back into them. We can sing all those great songs again.
I've our alarm clocks, yeah.
I've one final question, Síofra, and it's from Colm O'Rourke, who's a local historian to you there, up in close to Rathvilly on the Wicklow border. He's asking, have you any more information on your ancestral links to 1798? And I'll just add to that, would Kevin have been aware of those links as a young man growing up?
I'm not actually sure how aware Kevin was of the fact that his ancestor, say his great-great-great-grandfather Hutchinson, was a yeoman who was a turncoat who fought in the Battle of Hackettstown in 1798. But he certainly would have been very aware. I mean, you'd be surrounded by stories about 1798 down there, and the stories of Michael Dwyer hiding out, you know, in the mountains for 2 years. The ultimate rebel, really, wasn't he? How aware was Kevin? I don't know how aware he was, and he certainly wasn't aware that he was actually, you know, descended from Giraldus de Barry, who was King John Plantagenet's tutor. You know.
Well, thank you very much, Síofra. That was a fascinating lecture. I've got oodles of complimentary comments coming in here from everyone. I'll send them all on to you on email. Thanks again for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for asking me, Liam. Thank you.
And I'm going to put up a link to your book there now. So just see the cover of your book. That should pop up there now. So that's Síofra's book. And Síofra, you might just give us a quick outline of how to buy that. What's the best?
Yeah, I will actually. Yeah. So really, well, you can go onto Curragh Books website, www.curraghbooks.com, and then you'll see the book there. You can buy it through the publisher. You can also contact me. Do you want me to put it up here? And I can't see how to do that at the moment, but you can also buy one through me. But I would encourage everybody at the moment, because of the terrible, you know, situation we're in right now, to go to your local bookshop and ask them to order it in, because that will not only help the book sell, but it will help, you know, them as booksellers, you know, and they'll do it very quickly. I'm pretty sure that most bookshops will do it very quickly. So I really recommend that as one of the best ways to get the book. Go to your local bookshop. If it's not fully open, you can phone them. And I know that the bookshop in Bray, for example, I know that they allow you to say something through the front door, so they don't let you in.
All the shops now are doing a kind of a pick and collect service. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Síofra, thank you so much. Really, really enjoyable. For anyone who misses the lecture and you want to spread the word, we'll have it up on YouTube in the next 24 hours. So Thank you so much again, Síofra.
Thank you very much, Liam, and everybody. Thank you for coming along.
Slán, ihuwa.
Slán, ihuwa.